Hello and welcome to a Talmud Israeli production. Today we'll review the highlights of this week's course of Daf Yomi study, Masechet Eruvin, pages 56 through 62, Nun Vav through Samach Bet. 56. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis learned in a Braita. Baal Rava, the person who is a surveyor who was hired to establish the Tchum Shabbat, the Sabbath boundary, and is supposed to square off the sides of the city, Mirab Abribua Olam, what he should do is have the sides correspond to the directions of the earth, east, west, north, and south. No tens fanal tzvon. You should put the northern boundary of the Tchum facing due north, and the southern boundary facing due south. However, not all the surveyors are going to have that kind of accurate scientific knowledge, especially in antiquity before there was modern instrumentation. So Rabbi Yossi offers a different way for them to square the city. If you do not know how to use the methods of the directions of the earth, then you shall use the relative position of the sun at sunrise and sunset on the longest and shortest days of the year, and that those 4 points will function as the 4 corners of the Tchum, and then the city can be squared. Nun Zayin, 57. If a city is shaped like a bow, if between the two sides of the bow that are projecting outward there is less than 4,000 cubits, then we shall measure the Tchum Shabbat, the 2,000 amot of Tchum Shabbat, from the imaginary bowstring that connects the two sides of the bow. However, in Lav, if there is greater than 4,000 cubits along that imaginary bowstring, then Modadin Lamin HaKeshet, we do not use the bowstring, but rather we measure the Tchum Shabbat from the city itself, from the bow proper. Nunchet, 58. Ein mekadrin lo be'egla arufa v'lo ba'arei miklat pnei shehen shel Torah. The Mishnah tells us that we use a piercing method to get through mountains when we're measuring the Tchum Shabbat. That although a person would have to walk up the hill and down the hill, and that would take more time than the direct line from point A to point B piercing through the mountain, when it comes to Tchum, we are lenient, and we will allow the piercing method to be employed. However, when it comes to Egla Arufa, the decapitated heifer, which is a ritual that is done when there is a dead body found and we do not know who killed this person, and we have to measure to see which is the closest city, and that the elders of that city shall do the ritual of the Egla Arufa. So we have to measure between the two closest cities which one is actually closer. And for this purpose, we will not use Mekadrin, the principle of piercing, but rather we will measure how a person would actually have to walk up the hill and down the hill. And also, for Ir Miklat, for a city of refuge, the Torah wants us to have cities of refuge that are equally distant from each other, so that every person in Eretz Yisrael is not that far away from an Ir Miklat. And so for this purpose, the method of piercing is not good enough. We have to measure on the basis of how a person would actually walk, which means up the hill and down the hill. Nun Tet. The Mishnah says, that the sages established the laws of Tchum in a manner not to be strict, but rather to be lenient. In other words, there are many baked-in leniencies that we find in this tractate about how we measure the Tchum, so as to give people more wiggle room on Shabbat than purely the 2,000 amot, with the squaring of the city being a conventional example of that. However, the Gemara quotes a Braita that says the exact opposite. It says, that the sages established these things not to be lenient, but to be strict. So how do we reconcile seemingly contradictory perspectives about what the essence or the nature of the Tchum law is? Ravina gives an answer, and it's a very simple answer, that when it comes to the details of the Tchum law, we do not want to be strict with people. We do not want to have an onerous law on the public. So the tendency is towards leniency, towards lahakel. However, the very concept of the Tchum is itself only a derabanan, only a rabbinic law, which means it's necessarily being more strict than the Torah law. So that is lechumra, lahachmir. And so that's how we reconcile the two concepts. It is lahakel in its strategies, but lahachmir in the broader sense that it's stricter than Torah law. Samach, 60. If you place your Eruv Techumin in the extension of the city, the 70 2/3 amma area that surrounds the city, alternatively in the squared off areas beyond the inhabited portions of the city, but within the square, So then you've done nothing, you've accomplished nothing, because your goal was to allow you to walk beyond the Tchum, beyond the 2,000 Amot limit, and yet you already were able to walk to the spot where you put your Eruv. So you were able to walk to 2,000 Amos beyond where you put your Eruv. You've gained nothing, therefore your Eruv Tchumin is of no consequence. Samach Aleph, 61. Shavat Ba'ir, if you had your Sabbath rest in the city, even if it is a huge city the size of Antioch, which was a major city in the Byzantine times, in the days of the Mishnah and Talmud, or you had your Sabbath residence in a cave, even a cave as large as the cave of King Zedekiah, who used the cave to try to escape from Jerusalem before the destruction of the city. So, Mahalech et Kula, v'chutzla pamama. You are allowed on Shabbat to walk the entire length and breadth of that either city or that cave, even though it's tremendously in size, many kilometers wide, and you can go 2,000 cubits beyond that. So although a person who is resting for the Shabbat in the middle of nowhere only has 2,000 cubits in every direction, a person who's in a major metropolis has the whole metropolis and 2,000 cubits in each direction beyond the metropolis. Samach Bet, 62. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Halacha Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov. The law follows Eliezer ben Yaakov, that generally speaking, whenever Eliezer ben Yaakov is involved in machloket, the halacha will be decided in his favor. So a question was asked from Abaye to Rav Yosef. If it's such an obvious point that we rule in accordance with Eliezer ben Yaakov, then is it so that a student can issue a halachic pronouncement in the presence of his Rebbe, of his master, when it's such an obvious and easy question? Generally speaking, we do not allow, we do not encourage, we strongly discourage a student, even an ordained student, to issue halachic rulings in the presence of his own teacher. It's disrespectful. It's a violation of the tradition. And so what happens if the matter at hand, the question, is such an easy question? Can we cut the student some slack and allow him to answer this question in the presence of his Rebbe? To this, Rav Yosef responded to Abaye that even on the question of eating eggs with kutach, which is eggs with a milk-based condiment, and the halacha is you're allowed to eat it. It's not basar b'chalav, it's only eggs with chalav. And yet still, Rav Chisda would not answer that question all the days that Rav Huna was alive. Meaning that even for obvious questions, we still hold on to the tradition that a student does not issue a halachic pronouncement in the presence of his teacher. Everyone have a great week. Chag Sameach.